My name is Jocelyn Bell Burnell, and I'm the current president of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And it's my very great pleasure to welcome you here this evening and to deal with one or two administrative matters. So the Royal Society of Edinburgh is Scotland's national academy. We have about 1,600 fellows, distinguished fellows, top academics, leaders of professions, business and civil leaders, practicing artists, musicians, writers, poets. We cover the whole range of academia and more. Very, very broad fellowship. And the aim of the Royal Society is using those elected fellows to contribute to the social, cultural and economic well-being of Scotland through, using the words of our original inauguration, through learning and useful knowledge. And this lecture is jointly with the Albertus Institute, and I now call on John Sybil to speak a bit about the Albertus Institute.
I should now like to add my welcome on behalf of the Albertus Institute, and a particular welcome to members of the German consulate, representing, of course, the country where the events on which we focus this evening all began some 500 years ago this month. I appreciate that an awful lot of you this evening will probably not yet have heard of the Albertus Institute, which is why, as you came in, you should have received a sheet telling you something about us. So rather than say any more at this stage, when you're all champing at the bit to get to the meat of this evening's event, can I encourage you, please, to read the information we have provided. We are delighted and indeed privileged to be holding our first annual lecture here in the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and it is partly sponsorship from the Royal Society that has enabled us to be here tonight. In addition, I should like to acknowledge the following who have also contributed generously to make this evening possible: the Sir Halley Stewart Trust, the Order of Preachers, the Dominican Order, and Messrs. Lyon and Turnbull, who are also displaying at the reception following the lecture an early edition of Luther's complete works printed between 1572 and 1586 that underline very much what a prolific writer he was. The other slip handed to you asks you to supply your email address if you would like to hear more about our events, and if you would like indeed to make a small contribution via gift aid if appropriate. There is a basket at the reception desk for any completed slips or contributions. I should also like to take this opportunity to say a particular thank you to Hannah Bentley of the RSE for all her help in making this evening's arrangements. For all of you, and I'm sure there are many here this evening, who know Dr. Brian Lang, who will now take over as chairman for the rest of the evening, you will appreciate why he immediately sprang to mind as the best possible fit for tonight's event. As a former deputy chairman and chief executive of the British Library, he will have had responsibility for copies of many of the books to which, no doubt, Professor Pettegree is about to refer. As a former principal and vice-chancellor of the University of St Andrews, he also, of course, had responsibility for this evening's speaker. Brian, I can't put the clock back and return you to your responsibility for the BL, should indeed you still pine for that. But for one glorious hour, I can turn the clock back for this evening alone and hand you responsibility for Professor Andrew Pettegree again. Thank you.
John, thank you for these for these welcoming remarks, some of which I recognise. The idea of being responsible for Professor Pettegree is an interesting illusion, I think, is all I can describe that as being. However, it gives me very great pleasure to welcome you all here this evening and introduce to you one of our most distinguished historians. Dr. Andrew Pettegree is Professor of Modern History at the University of St Andrews, but is one of the world's leading authorities on the Reformation. And as you, of course, you will understand, this year marks the Quincentenary of the start of the Reformation. Andrew's first book was a study of religious refugees in the 16th century, and since then he's published on the Dutch Revolt, on the Reformation in Germany, in France, and in England. And he's also published a more general survey of the 16th century. And his more recent focus has been on the history of communication, and especially the history of the book. As the son of an Edinburgh printer, as well as being a former chief executive of the British Library, it's a subject very close to my heart, Andrew. But Andrew also runs a research group that has just completed a survey of all books published before 1601, known as the Universal Short Title Catalogue, which, as you will appreciate, is a major resource for scholars of that period. Andrew is the lead editor of two monograph series, the St Andrews Studies in Reformation History and the Library of the Written Word. Now, I'm conscious that I stand between you and Professor Pettegree. As well as being a distinguished historian, Andrew is well known in St Andrews as being a lively, stimulating, and articulate teacher. And we will greatly enjoy what he has to say this evening. Andrew Pettegree.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for that warm welcome, and thank you for coming out this evening. Brian is right that those of us who work on Luther have had a very busy year. We seem to have crisscrossed the planet, speaking to church groups, scholarly gatherings, radio stations, and the general public. Now, this has been great fun. I've got a lot of air miles in the process and some eccentric invitations, not least to be the historian in residence for Luther the Rock Opera, which is performed for the first time in Wittenberg this summer. And this is a magnificent work based on this graphic novel. It begins with Katharina von Bora, Luther's wife, and a chorus of nuns, and then stages the burning of Jan Hus in the second scene. You can imagine this would be quite an expensive opera. Reading the graphic novel, it doesn't quite hit the ecumenical note that we've aimed for in our Scottish commemorations, so we haven't staged it yet in St Andrews. In all of this, I've been playing a game of hide and seek with my audiences, and particularly with interviewers, who all seem on a mission to have me say Luther was like Donald Trump. And I see that the event at the Scottish Parliament's Politics Festival next week is heading down the same road, where the panellists will be faced with a leading question: was the printing press Luther's Twitter? No, I say patiently, Luther was not like Donald Trump. What we can say is this: we are indeed living through an age of technology change as profound as that experienced by Luther. Then it was the transition from manuscripts to print. Now the transition from print to digital. And in any such age, the first adopters of new technologies have a distinct advantage, not least because their opponents think that the technology is in some way illegitimate. In 2016, the New York Times seemed to believe that if they could demonstrate repeatedly that Donald Trump's tweets were crude, offensive, or untrue, then the electorate would take note and act accordingly. Besides, Twitter was unpresidential. We all know how that turned out. Likewise, with the Reformation, it was difficult for his opponents to follow Luther in writing in German because they believed serious theological discussion should take place in Latin. So for a crucial passage of time, Luther had the field to himself. And by the time his opponents began to follow him into writing in German, the damage was done. In that way, print made the Reformation, or at least gave it the chance, to make its case to the German people. Now that's one narrative of print and the Reformation. But today I also want to give you another, one in which not only did Luther profit from print, but to a large extent he also rescued it. Printing was not an invention destined to succeed. Indeed, in the 60 years before Luther, it had struggled to make its way. So this is a story of how Luther gave a stumbling technology a second chance to find its way in a media environment. In this 500th anniversary of the Reformation, much will be said of print and Protestantism. So it's worth reminding ourselves that it was the Catholic Church that in the 70 years before the Reformation provided the most reliable clients of the new industry. Liturgical books, volumes of sermons, books of hours, and devotional texts gave the publishers the sort of steady work necessary to sustain a print shop. Of course, nothing was more profitable for the print shops than the varied panoply of texts that accompanied an indulgence campaign. And we have here one of the indulgences from the St. Peter's campaign of 1515, against which Luther was protesting. So the synergy of print and Protestantism is not as obvious as it might appear. This was a relationship that had to be crafted rather than was inevitable. I want to explore this, how this was achieved, in three parts, the three acts of my title. First, I'll review how Luther built what was in effect a new audience for print by leading new readers into the realms of theological controversy, in the process making an unlikely print capital out of a small outpost of the university world, Wittenberg. Luther's movement also fashioned a new livery for religious print, what I've referred to in my own book as Brand Luther. My second part considers how print could also serve the movement in places where high visibility ceased to be an asset and instead became a source of deadly danger. And in my final section, I'll turn to the 17th century and consider the relationship between print and Protestantism in Europe's most sophisticated and innovative book world, the Dutch Republic. Now, before Luther came on the scene, print was, to an extent, still a technology looking for a purpose. In the 70 years since Gutenberg had concluded his successful experiments with movable type, this is a page from Gutenberg's Bible, publishers had essentially mastered the technical aspects of printing. But in other respects, this was a remarkably conservative industry. Printers had either published the books urged on them by intellectuals, or, mindful of consumer resistance to text that differed too radically from manuscripts, they had relied on a diet of medieval bestsellers. And Gutenberg's Bible is a very good example of this. It's crafted to look as much like a manuscript as possible. This innate conservatism contrasted markedly with the radical innovative spirit that is meant to have characterized the new industry. With too many copies of the same narrow range of text, unsold copies piled up, and printers ran out of money. The result was a necessary restructuring of the industry. Having spread its tentacles very rapidly through the European landmass, fueled by curiosity and technological enthusiasm, rather than by any thought-through business plan, print gradually retreated to the major commercial cities, where publishers had access to investment that could sustain the sort of costs required for big books like this. I should say that Gutenberg was one of the many printers who went bankrupt. This is just to illustrate that process. This is print in the first era of printing. And you see printers spread across the Alps from Germany down into Italy and to some extent further away. But if you go through in 5-year blocks, you see these tiny pimples appearing and disappearing. So whereas print was indeed experienced in 200 places before 1500, most of them soon disappeared. And what you see by the last decade is this huge concentration again around the central spine. If you draw a line between Antwerp and Rome, something like 90% of printing is produced on 200 kilometers either side of that. So it's not a story of wide dispersal, but of concentration. This is a sign that print was struggling. It was struggling to emulate the manuscript model where books could be produced anywhere. Luther's movement offered Germany's printers what the new technology required for ultimate sustainability: access to new readers through a new sort of product, shorter, simpler books, cheaper to produce, in German rather than Latin, and selling to local audiences. The transformative impact of this second print revolution could be seen in the extraordinary history of publishing in Luther's own city, Wittenberg. Wittenberg was the sort of place that should have had no real role in a rationally organized print industry. I would show you where it was on this map, but it doesn't appear on this map. There's no printing in Wittenberg before 1502. And from that point, printers would come and go with great regularity before Johann Grunenberg took over the shop in 1508. There were 5 printers in 6 years, which suggests no one was making any money. Like his predecessors, Grunenberg occupied himself printing small literary works on commission from the local professors and the routine work of academic administration, such as dissertation theses. The quality of this work was rudimentary, based on a narrow range of typefaces, inexpertly deployed. All told, between 1502 and 1516, 5 successive printers published a total of 123 books. That's a mere 9 books a year. No one could make money from that. Now look at the Luther effect. And here I've taken a slide from the Universal Short Title Catalogue, the resource to which Brian referred. And you see here that between 1517 and 1546, Wittenberg publishers turned out at least 2,700 works, an average of 90 a year. This represents about 3 million individual copies. It includes many of the milestone works of the era, including multiple copies of Luther's German Bible. By 1525, there were 5 printers active in the town. Some established printing houses that would last for decades. This vast blossoming of what was essentially a new industry was entirely due to Martin Luther. 1 in 3 of all the books published during these decades were Luther's own works, and another 20% those of his Wittenberg colleagues in the university. And this Luther effect proves enduring. Even after his death, the industry continued to grow. And by the end of the 16th century, Little Wittenberg was the largest printing town in Germany. Now, 3 major developments were necessary to achieve this transformation. The first was the extraordinary magnetic power of Luther's own writing and his instinctive grasp of what publishers required of him. In the 3 years after the publication of the 95 Theses, Luther published 65 original works. Most were short, about half of them were less than 8 pages long. Many were published in German. Characteristically, they would be published first in Wittenberg, and then they would ricochet through Germany's major publishing cities, Leipzig, Nuremberg, Augsburg, Basel, and Strasbourg, through locally published reprints. It was relatively easy to reprint a work which is only 8 pages long and relatively inexpensive. Now, this again was a fundamentally new model of publishing. In the first stage of print, dealing largely with expensive Latin books, it made far more sense to produce one large edition somewhere and then distribute it through Europe. But it was an expensive process, and every stage of the distribution reduced profit for the original publisher. With pamphlets, it was much easier to take a single copy, send it to a new city, and have a printer reset it in type there. An 8-page pamphlet could be printed and out on the streets in 2 days. It could be sold out by the end of the week. In other words, it was precisely the sort of model to build printing in small centres of production that had been missing since the beginning of print. By the time Luther came to the Diet of the German Empire at Worms in 1521, an astonishing 615 editions of his works had been printed. Not bad for a man who'd published nothing till he was in his 30s. By the end of that year, he was not only the most published author of his day, but the most published author, living or dead, in the history of printing. He'd just surpassed Cicero. And 2 years before, he'd surpassed Erasmus, which is one reason for the very bad relationship between these two men. Now, this barrage of print helped launch Luther as a public figure and certainly thwarted the church authorities' hopes of having him done away with. But most of the profits of this work were accruing to shops outside Wittenberg. To the end of 1519, there was still only one print shop, and that was run by the stolid Royal Grunenberg, a fervent supporter of Luther, but conservative in habits, as you can see, nothing of the bangs and whistles of this one for Royal Grunenberg, and maddeningly slow. This is another of his works. He's trying to be a bit fancier here, but as you see, it doesn't quite work. It's just not very good. So Luther took the matter in hand. In the summer of 1519, he'd invited to Wittenberg the Leipzig printer Melchior Lothar. Now, Lothar was an unlikely ally. Deeply embedded in the print industry, he had lately taken a leading role in the campaign against Luther. It had been Lothar who, in 1515, had published the Manual for Confessors for the indulgence campaign that had so offended Luther. Yet even Lothar could see the profits to be made from printing Luther, and the pragmatism of printers is a leading part of this story. In 1519, a deal was struck. Lothar would send to Wittenberg his son, Melchior Jr., along with a selection of his typefaces, far superior to those of the unfortunate Royal Grunenberg. With the arrival of Lothar Jr., the look and the typographical proficiency of Wittenberg editions improved immeasurably. This is the father publishing in Leipzig, and this is the son publishing in Wittenberg, and you can see that much the same sort of thing. But this was an unfinished revolution. Although Wittenberg books were now more proficiently produced, this was still, in Lothar's case, essentially the style of Leipzig, and you can see this quite quickly if we can toggle back and between them. To create a specifically Wittenberg style, the movement had to make use of its most potent latent asset, the enormous workshop factory of Wittenberg's court painter, Lucas Cranach. Now, Cranach is best known to us as an artist, one of the great artists of the Northern Renaissance. And it was he, too, who created the great sequence of portraits of Martin Luther, here with his wife, Katharina von Bora. Luther and Cranach were also close and firm allies in the work of the Reformation. What is less well known is that Cranach was also a major player in the Wittenberg printing industry. From 1521, he ran his own press, and with characteristic thoroughness, he also obtained his own paper mill. In that way, he would control the whole process, a very good example of vertical integration. Now, Cranach ran his own press for only a few years, but even after he sold it on, he remained intimately involved in the printing industry, since his workshop enjoyed an effective monopoly of the production of illustrative woodcuts. It was this that allowed Cranach to transform the look of Wittenberg's books. To this point, Wittenberg printing had mostly been associated with the spare utilitarian texts of Raul Grünenberg. Printers outside Wittenberg, as we've seen, had improved the look somewhat with decorative borders. Cranach offered a radically different solution: a title page frame made up not of separate panels, but a single woodcut. Here, the design was allowed to flow around a blank central panel into which the text of the title could then be inserted. It was a masterpiece of design innovation, with one step solving a complex problem of integrating text and decorative material while allowing space for artistic expression on the front of the book. The block borders of the early Luther editions published in Leipzig and elsewhere tended to be dark and densely patterned. The Wittenberg frames have a lightness of touch, a clarity of line, so they serve to place the work but not to draw the eye away from the central elements, the title, the name, the place. Now, Cranach brought to this new engagement with book design the accumulated expertise of one of Germany's most capable and imaginative artistic entrepreneurs. The result is a whole series of masterpieces in miniature, bringing to the title pages of Wittenberg's Reformation Flugschriften a balance, poise, and sophistication that they had previously lacked. The distinctive look provided by Cranach's title page designs was the final component of a puzzle that had been taxing Germany's printers: how to make the best of their most marketable property, the new phenomenon that was Martin Luther. Now every element was in place: a title page border that arrested the eye, and a text that highlighted the two most significant elements of what was on offer: Luther's name and the place of origin. And you see by now Luther's name and Wittenberg have been starkly separated. What's important on this title page is as much the white space, the gaps, as the text. Previous to this, authors' names had been just wrapped into the mass of text in the first half. Often the early Luther works have Lut on one line and Ter on the next line. So this is a huge improvement. And here you see it again. This is what I describe as brand Luther, with one of the most magnificent here of the Cranach title page borders. This was brand Luther, piled up on the booksellers' stalls. These books would be instantly recognizable as the work of Luther and his Wittenberg coterie. And you can see how successful they were by the speed with which these were plagiarized outside Wittenberg. This is, in fact, is not a Wittenberg title page. It's one based on one of Cranach's designs, but produced in Augsburg, though it clearly claims to be in Wittenberg. One of my graduate students, Drew Thomas, is doing work on all these Luther counterfeits and is finding an extraordinary quantity of them. I think he's found 124 editions when these counterfeits are used outside Wittenberg. Now, this must have been painful for Cranach to see his intellectual property violated in this way, but it was fantastic for the Reformation because it spread the brand through Germany. By this point, Luther and Wittenberg had achieved transformation in the German print world. The tiny local industry of Wittenberg had been transformed. By the time of Luther's death in 1546, the city had been reborn. A new city built of stone-built mansions, some of them owned by the princes of the print trade. Luther was not only Wittenberg's leading intellectual force and icon, he was also the motor of the city economy. And that's one of the reasons they loved him so much. Now, as Luther lay dying in 1546, he could at least take comfort that his German church would live on. But elsewhere in Europe, the perspectives for the Reformation had become less rosy. For the second of our three acts, we turn our attention to the beleaguered evangelical movement in the powerful states of Western Europe, where the initial interest in Luther's message had failed to coalesce as a cohesive church. And I think here of England, of France, and the Low Countries. The initial promise of evangelical reform in the Low Countries was quickly dissipated, crushed between the determination of Charles V to permit no Lutheran preaching in his patrimonial lands and Luther's own indifference to lands outside Germany. In France, after initial flirtation with the rhetoric of reform, Francis I, the king, would adopt the same uncompromising line. And Luther's bad-tempered quarrel with Henry VIII ensured that the English king would have no truck with Wittenberg either. In all of these places, legislation was enacted to prevent the production, circulation, or even ownership of Lutherans' texts. This set printers sympathetic to the Reformation a quite different set of problems. The confident branding that immediately identified Luther's works to potential purchases in Wittenberg or Augsburg was impossible in these places. Indeed, the discovery of any text that could be connected to Luther put both printer and purchaser in deadly peril. In these very different circumstances, Reformation print could not be confidently proclaimed. Rather, it had to be smuggled into the hands of sympathizers without placing them in evident danger. Any of Luther's texts now published in France, in the Netherlands, or in England were carefully disguised as orthodox devotional texts of the sort popular and abundant in the early 16th century. And this is an example from France. As a further precaution, printers often withheld their names from the title page or the colophon and used only commonplace typefaces without any of the decorative features that would have identified their workmanship. When a heretical text was found, the authorities very often just took it round the print shops and said, "Do you know who did this?" in the expectation, normally correct, that the printers would know exactly who did it by the typefaces they were using. By and large, this worked well enough. Indeed, so well has this deception worked that some of these texts are only being identified as Luther's in the very recent years. The middle decades of this century brought an evangelical revival, but one that significantly not to Wittenberg for inspiration, but to the Swiss Reformed churches, and particularly to John Calvin in Geneva. The Dutch had their own places of refuge, England and Germany, principally in London and Emden. For the Dutch, Emden became a new centre of evangelical printing. As the movement grew in confidence, so did the typography. Works by Calvin and the leading reformers were not explicitly identified as such. You don't see Calvin's name on these title pages. But the disposition of type and choice of typeface was sufficiently distinctive to be clearly recognizable to those who sought them out. Now, some years ago, I travelled to Hanover to see a single volume which I believed to be the work of an Emden printer. I was doing a bibliography of these Emden works. When the book arrived in the reading room, it took me less than 5 seconds to confirm this as the work of an Emden printer, since I now knew his style and the fonts of type at his disposal extremely well. As I was on my way back to the airport, it struck me that if this was so obvious to me, it must have been equally obvious to any alert ecclesiastical officer charged with rooting out heresy, who had seen other examples of his work. The same thought occurred when I examined a group of Calvinist texts published in Normandy at Caen in the first years of the French Wars of Religion. These were quite obviously the work of a small group of printers who had taken advantage of the rapid growth of Huguenot congregations and indeed were themselves committed members of the Protestant Church. They took advantage of the gradual loosening of controls in these years in France to reprint Genevan staples of Protestant worship for the local churches which had just been set up. So what we're dealing with here, and here's a reconstruction of the alphabet of initial letters used in some of these works, and you see they're very distinctive. No one would have been fooled by this. So what we've seen here is rather different from the heavily disguised editions of 40 years previously. Rather, what we see here is a middle way between the brazen self-advertisement of Brand Luther, of the Cranach Wittenberg editions, and true concealment. By 1561, it was becoming increasingly obvious that efforts to persecute French Calvinism had failed. On the other hand, it was not yet clear that attempts to obtain formal toleration would succeed. This is a very liminal moment. The appearance of the Caen editions reflects this state of uncertainty. On the one hand, these editions would have been immediately recognizable to their intended purchasers. But because the printers did not explicitly identify the works as their own, the local authorities could look the other way. The absence of an imprint, the absence of a printer's name, gave the local authorities plausible deniability. And if Catholic control was ever re-established, as indeed it shortly was, the city magistrates might hope to avoid awkward questions as to why they had not enforced the law more rigorously. In other words, what we're seeing here is something more subtle than a binary choice between books published with full bibliographical details and truly anonymous works. There are gradations between levels of anonymity, appropriate to times when the evangelical churches enjoyed some level of freedom, but the future was not yet clear. We see the same phenomenon in the Netherlands there we go. We see the same phenomenon in the Netherlands in 1566, when the Dutch revolt enjoyed its first brief springtime of hope. By this time, the Emden presses had their own badge of identity. You see it in this beautiful printer's mark here, a printer's mark so recognizably evangelical that it was even pirated by printers back in the Low Countries. And one of these is an Emden work, and one of these is an anonymous reprint done in the Netherlands. In the event, neither the Calvinists of Normandy nor the Antwerp Church would enjoy the freedoms they had so confidently anticipated during these heady times. In the Netherlands, it would not be in the heartlands of Flanders and Brabant, but in the northern province of Holland that the Calvinist Church finally established freedom from Spanish rule. By the end of the 16th century, Spain was forced to recognize the impossibility of recovering the northern provinces, and the Dutch Republic began its rapid ascent to its improbable status as Europe's most successful state. I want in the final section of this paper to consider the role of print in embedding the Calvinist Reformed Church at the heart of this new nation. Calvinists had been at the heart of the revolt, and they had their reward when they were granted the most prominent churches in the new state. But they were not granted a monopoly of a religion. Theirs was the only authorized church, but it was not the official church. People could choose where they attended. And so this was a very curious, mixed situation. How were the churches sustained in a peculiar environment where not all the citizens were obliged to attend the church, and a majority of those who did chose not to become full members? Only about a tenth of the population of this Calvinist state actually joined the Calvinist church. Once again, print played a crucial and to some extent underappreciated role. I say underappreciated because if we know anything of the book world of the Dutch Republic, we think of the great atlases of Blau, of which this is an example here, or the elegant pocket classics of the Elsevier's, a series self-evidently modelled on the Aldus editions that had taken the educated world by storm a century and a half previously. I'm privileged to own one of these volumes, so you can see by my hands here how very tiny these books are, and they were all arranged for classicists on the road, on the go. They were so popular in the age that this English scholar chose to be buried with his Elseviers. They were that popular. But if we look closely, we see that these works, though rightly praised for the elegance and technical magnificence, do not represent the centre of gravity of Dutch printing. What we see if we dig deeper into the publishing world of the Dutch Republic is a publishing culture of religious writing of a very different spirit, a literature of quiet devotion, cherished and deeply read. But to see this, we do have to look quite hard, because what survives in library collections today is in this respect a very poor guide to what was originally published. When editions of these devotional tracts do survive, it's almost invariably in just one single copy of an edition of 500, 700 or 1,000 books. A fairly sure sign that there are many others that have disappeared altogether. But if this is the case, if so many of the important books of the 16th and 17th century have been lost, how can we reconstruct this lost world? How can we recover these lost editions? How can one identify books read, used and loved and then discarded? The lost world books of the early modern print world. Well, this is the work to which we've now turned our attention in St Andrews, to recover books that can't be found in any library today. And this sort of work is not entirely uncontroversial in the book world, because the heart of bibliography is examining a book, making a record, and you can't do that with a lost book. But once you start, you realize that this is an absolutely necessary to understanding the print world of the early modern period, both its economics and people's reading preferences. And actually, it's much less hard than one might imagine, because the 16th and 17th century, and particularly the Dutch Republic, generated a mass of records, both printed and archival, pertinent to a search of this nature. The Dutch, for instance, were the first to adopt the book auctions, long lists of books coming from a personal library, which may not now be found in libraries. Their newspapers, and this is an example of an early newspaper, were also the first to carry advertisements. And in the first age, these were mostly advertisements for books. Again, you can collate these advertisements with surviving libraries to find lost books. They also have a lot of stock catalogues. Publishers issue stock catalogues, sometimes with printed prices. And all of these sources generate a mass of new data about books offered for sale, and we can compare these records, which are often of very high quality, with the records of known surviving editions. And the results are very illuminating. Let me, for instance, share with you a single advertisement from an Amsterdam weekly paper in 1643. This advertisement lists 8 books, all new editions of popular texts by the Amsterdam preacher and prolific author Roelof Petersen. These were all books which he published year by year, several times, often in up to 8 editions, one a year. But none of these 8 books survives today. In the case of one of these books, The Narrow Gate, or The Way to Salvation, Brandt will republish this again in 1646, where it's described as a 7th edition. None of these 7 editions have been traced. In 1642, he published The Praise of the Lord, described in the advertisement in the paper as the 9th edition. The 9th edition does survive, but we can document only one of the previous 8. Here then is a mass of popular devotional literature, published and republished up to 3 times a year, and extremely poorly represented in surviving copies. But contemporary publishers and booksellers realized the value of these works, for the Dutch Republic was, in the trade of books as with many other commodities, an economy which flourished through the realization of a large volume of business with small margins. And with these small devotional texts, the Dutch publishing world reached down into the realm of careful householders for whom the purchase of a book was a considered expense, carefully weighed against other small domestic luxuries. These were not people who could afford a Blau atlas, but they could afford little books like this. I want to end this section, my last section, by introducing one of my favourite characters from the busy world of devotional publishing, Dr. Gellius Baumer. Now, Baumer was not one of the titans of the religious conflicts of his day. He spent most of his career away from the epicenter of the conflict as a minister in Zutphen, on the border between Gelderland and Overijssel. Early in his working life, in common with so many Protestant ministers, he began work on a catechism, and this was published in 1621. It took a little time to take off, but by the 1640s it enjoyed considerable popularity. For the edition of 1647, Baumer composed a new preface sketching the history of its composition and relating how, as publishers became aware of its popularity, he was inundated with requests from booksellers asking him to update his work again. Yet, if we rely on the editions listed in the short title catalogue Netherlands, the collective catalogue of Dutch works, his pride seems rather a sin. It seems rather an exaggeration. We have a respectable 6 editions published between 1638 and 1650, a respectable number, but hardly overwhelming. But here we do Dr. Baumer an injustice, for when we begin to chase down references in other sources, this picture changes dramatically. It just so happens that in precisely this period, the documentary literature is particularly abundant, and that's why I have chosen these dates, 1638 to 1650. Let's look first at these advertisements. That's an example of how they appear in the paper. The advertisements we see on the left here, there are 5 copies listed in advertisements. They're all completely different from the 6 survivors. So with here we go from 7 to 12. I then turn to a rather splendid source called the Catalogus Universalis. This was issued by an Amsterdam publisher either every 6 months or a year and published everything that had been printed in the last year or half year. So these are very, very fine records. As you see, they're quite detailed. And we find there that the Catalogus Universalis has 8 references to Baumer's catechism. 5 of them conform to the advertisements, not surprisingly, or to surviving editions, but 3 of them are again new. We then looked at the stock catalogue of Hendrik Lawrenson. Now, he was one of Amsterdam's biggest booksellers, and as you see, well, you can't see, but I can, he had a lot of catechisms here, and these marked in blue are the catechisms of Baumer, advertised in 1649, which was the height of his success. And he offered customers a good range of what was available. If we add these to the study, we see that we have another 7, all sometimes conforming to the other records, confirming the veracity of these other records, but again, 3 more new ones. I then looked at the stock catalogue of Johannes Josonius, 1665. Now, by this point, Baumer was rather retreating in fashion. There was a new catechism in town, but he still had 3 editions of this for sale. And as you see, of these 3 editions, 1 is new. So by looking at these 4 sources, we've built up the number from 6 or 7 to 19, and that completely transforms our understanding of the importance of this text. 2 references in these sources confirm Baumer's recollection of first publication in 1621, because there's no surviving copy of the first edition. In the following decades, it will go on to be published in 10 different cities, in 4 different provinces, in multiple formats. Why does this all matter? It matters because the sort of books that were most intensively used by contemporaries were often the books that survived least well. A book like Balmer's Catechism was used every day, that was the point, and constantly thumbed. It might never have found a safe haven in the shelves of a library, and might have been too tatty to be passed down through the generations. In fact, by the time the parents died, the sons and daughters would have had their own more recent editions, so they just threw them away. And this is the great paradox of our understanding of the first age of print. And it's a troubling one. And that is that the books that survive best are those that find their way into a library quickly. And they have survived the centuries in between, often because they were not in fact much read. One of the things when we were going around France looking at all their rare books is we often felt that the great folio volumes that we took down off the shelves, we were probably the first person to be looking at them for 3 centuries. Books survive often because they are not used. Now this is, for book historians, for historians of any discipline, rather a troubling reflection. Devotional texts like these were particularly vulnerable because they were usually too large to be bound together in collections, which is why so many pamphlets survive, why we have so many of Luther's books still, is because they were bound together very early and library-less way. Recovering the devotional world of these ordinary men and women in the pew requires rather more than relying on collective bibliographies of library stock. A search which will always privilege big, expensive books, which libraries cherish, over the small books that contemporaries actually read. Now, with this, we're reaching the end of our drama in 3 acts. We've witnessed a triumph of adaptation and ingenuity, where the evangelical energies of a new religious movement were shaped and channeled by shrewd businessmen who crafted a product suitable for hugely varying circumstances. The resulting reconfiguration of the print industry was very different from the elegant philological text envisaged by the first boosters of print in the 1470s. This, of course, should not surprise us. Having lived through the latest wholesale media transformation of the digital age, we know that new technology is always accompanied by a blizzard of false prophecy. The birth of the internet was initially perceived in an eerie echo of humanist praise of print in the 15th century as an ennobling tool of enlightenment, liberating and empowering public debate. The crystal ball of these technological optimists did not show them the rise of online betting or internet pornography. If they welcomed the prospect of the citizen journalist, they would not have celebrated the internet troll, nor would they have anticipated the very recent epidemic of fake news. Seen as a means of empowerment, the digital revolution has indeed ended up shaking the fundamental values that have for centuries underpinned the information economy, the need for intelligence to be verifiably true. The fundamental problem that bedevils all the transforming technologies and the transforming technological shifts of the modern era is the difficulty of monetizing good intentions. In 15th century Europe, Gutenberg's new technology was greeted throughout Europe with a sort of awed fascination. Every prince and every city yearned to have a part of this ingenious means of multiplying knowledge. But when the first excitement receded, it was left to the practical men of business, faced with huge debts in their ledgers and stacks of unsold copies, to bring fiscal discipline to the new industry. The Reformation offered the vital way forward, new products for new readers at affordable prices. Print played a vital role in spreading the evangelical message and embedding the new teachings. But the Reformation also did a great deal to usher print towards a sustainable future. Thank you very much.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much for that, opening that very vivid window on that particular communication revolution. Now, Andrew has agreed to take some questions or to listen to comments. Could you, if you want to speak, could you wait until a member of the RIC staff gives you a microphone? And also, please introduce yourself. Who would like to be first?
Thank you. Could I just preface my comment? I've got a mid-19th century Gibbon's Decline and Fall, which came to me from my grandfather through my aunt, my father, and myself. And I think only my aunt's managed to get her way through it. Sits on my shelf, forbiddingly. Your new list, have you hopes of utilising that and perhaps the internet in order to, sorry, I didn't mention my name, David Breeze, utilising the internet perhaps in order to perhaps bring to light these books which are lurking unbeknownst in various dark places?
Well, thank you for that question. Yes, certainly we are. This project, the Universal Short Title Catalogue, would not have been possible without digital resources, which allows us to access the collections of many libraries around the world. When we first started this work, 20, 30 years ago, we went to a lot of, over 300 libraries in France, and literally went through card indexes, sometimes manuscript catalogues. Sometimes we went around, just went around the shelves looking for 16th century books. Now thousands of libraries have online catalogues which we can access from St Andrews. What we haven't yet really been able to access is private collections. And where we think these lost books will help us is when we integrate those into the Universal Short Title Catalogue, indicating that there is no surviving copy. Perhaps private owners, which are very important as collectors, particularly in the current day Netherlands, will reveal themselves as an owner of one of these books. So yes, we feel that digital technologies will be essential to developing this project further.
Thank you. Who's next? Yes.
Yes. Do you not think?
Sorry,
that,
could you introduce yourself, please?
Yes, Eric Salzen. Yes. Do you not think that what really set printing going was by adopting the vernacular, by printing in the language that ordinary people could read, and therefore enormously increase the customer base?
That's a very important part of the story, but you have to bear in mind that for the first 70 years of printing, that simply didn't happen. If you go into the Universal Short Title Catalogue, which you can just access as USTC, it has a language search and facets along the side which allow you to do this analysis. And in the first 50 years of the incunabula period, well over 2/3 of all books were published in Latin.
And they were that's my point, precisely.
Yeah. And Luther's genius was that he understood not only the importance of the vernacular, and this was actually the most dangerous moment where he stepped outside the protection of the church, because as a professor he was perfectly entitled to suggest dissertation theses for discussion. This was not in itself heretical, but when he chose to speak over the heads of his clerical confreres to a German audience, that in a way was the point he crossed the line. And not only did he did that, but he understood the point of brevity. Now, theological writing of the Middle Ages was not notable for its brevity. Rather the reverse. You know, a sermon could be 2 or 3 hours long, and it would be delivered to people standing rather than sitting. It was a form of pilgrimage going to these sermons. It was an endurance test, and that was rather the point. And yet Luther called his milestone work a sermon on indulgence and grace. I wonder if this was intended ironically, because this was 1,500 words long. It's 20 short paragraphs. It can be read aloud in 10 minutes. And this intuitive understanding of what was required as a new communication mechanism is the great imponderable of the Reformation. How Luther, someone who was now already in his middle age, could have intuitively understood the way to approach this wider audience is one of the most remarkable aspects of the Reformation century.
And if I can interject, I think you're absolutely right. The use of Latin, the property of the priesthood, the ruling class, broken in due course by William Tyndale, who published the first New Testament in English and was hanged for his pains. Next question.
My point was, you see, that Chinese had printing 1,000 years before, but it never took off because they did not have an alphabet in which they could print that ordinary people could read.
Yeah, I mean, big claims are made for the Chinese invention of printing, but mostly not by the Chinese. I mean, most of the early Chinese experiments with printing were done with wood blocks rather than movable type. And as you quite rightly say, the alphabet is so enormous that these were luxury products for a very small readership. What they certainly never did was establish a mass industry.
Yes, on the side.
My name is Neil Keeble. Thank you very much indeed for that wonderfully lucid lecture. I wondered if I could just develop the point that's been made, though. I take it that your suggestion that Luther has a kind of innate literary genius in his brevity, I'm persuaded by that. But on the other hand, you need not only that, but you need the capacity to read these brief tracts. And I wonder if you could make a comment on the importance of literacy and the development of literacy to the development of print, and whether you would agree that parallel with the production of these texts, the drive to educate and develop a literate audience is a crucial part of the story.
I think you're quite right, and the ground had been well prepared for this in the 100 years before the Reformation by an enormous forward step in lay literacy. In the High Middle Ages, priests are essentially Europe's readers and writers. It's essentially a tradecraft. But as literacy spreads, prompted largely by occupational need, by people who need to read for their occupation, this creates, particularly in the cities, a substantial group of people who are themselves readers. Now, that is important, but it must also be recognized that in Germany, probably most people who heard about Luther probably heard by word of mouth rather more than by reading. And reading was a form of reinforcement. Most of the pamphlets published by Luther would have been read by people who already knew that they supported his position. They were bought as much as tokens of allegiance as as something to read. And for this reason, I don't believe that the buying of Reformation pamphlets was necessarily confined to the literate. So you have three levels, if you like. You have his Latin works, which played a crucial role also in persuading other priests to join the Reformation, because the Reformation never succeeded in one of the German cities without the active promotion of a local minister, going into their own pulpit and saying, you may have heard of Martin Luther, but I agree with his teaching. That was absolutely crucial in places like Nuremberg and Augsburg and Basel. Then you have the pamphlets which were reaching a wider lay audience, and then you have those who heard about the Reformation, partly by these being read to them, because of course collective reading is a large part of the recreational experience of this age, or simply by gossip on the streets. Luther was important because he was a public event. He was a public phenomenon as much as a religious teacher. And it's that which also sparked people's curiosity in his message.
That's at the back. I think you're first.
Thank you. My name is Derek Prime. I think that Luther and Tyndale were more or less contemporaries. Is there any evidence of them meeting or being influenced by one another?
Not to my knowledge, though English people who were inspired by Tyndall did then subsequently go to Wittenberg, and many of the relatively small number of Englishmen who adopted the Reformation during this period had been to Wittenberg and back. The English Reformation was to a large extent fizzled and died in the first period, and but for Henry VIII's matrimonial difficulties, it's hard to have seen England moving out of the Protestant allegiance that it eventually adopted.
Yes. Could you wait for the microphone? Thank you.
My name is Zenon Bankowski. You talked about the monetization of the book or the print, and that spread it. Isn't it odd that in the digital technology, the monetization is not the agent of the spreading; it's the agent of the restriction?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you can make some sort of comparison between the crash of printing in the 1470s and 1480s and the sort of dot-com boom and bust of the 1990s, where enormous amounts are being invested in print in the first instance because it's the fashionable thing. Just in the same way as share price of many of the dot-com companies went skyrocketing, even though none of them had made a penny of profit. And that's very important, I think, for technological innovation, that fascination fuels investment. But of course, fascination also dies, and princes decided perhaps instead they'd like some tapestries, or they'd like a lion for their menagerie, or they'd invest in sculpture. And it's at that point where the weakness of the economic model became evident. I mean, if you look at the statistics, the volume of printing really does go through the roof. And I think you could say much the same thing of digital technologies, that the reach of the major digital resources grow larger and larger. I'm not quite sure what you mean by the restriction in that respect, but it certainly doesn't really apply in the age of print.
I meant that loads of the people who push the internet moan the fact that the monetization of it restricts it because people can't get hold of it anymore because they have to pay, whereas before it was free and going to everybody.
Yeah, I think we're in a mixed period in that respect. Yes, certainly we see paywalls going up for certain resources, but you can still find plenty of new ones springing up to take their place. I don't think we're yet in a fixed state. I wrote a book a few years ago called The Invention of News, which stopped happily with the French Revolution, and the publishers want me to write a sequel. But I'm rather inclined to see how the story ends, actually, before I try to tell it.
So I wonder if I could interject. It's fascinating to think about the particular communications revolution that you're describing with the one that we're going through now. I think what is fascinating about our present information revolution is it's only 25 years old. We have heroes of this revolution: Bill Gates, Tim Berners-Lee. Well, Bill Gates is a hero now because he's giving the money away. Steve Jobs. But the fact that we're conscious of being part of this revolution, we watch it. We wait for the next Apple product. What's Microsoft going to do next? But Andrew, was there a consciousness during the period that you describe that people taking part were doing something that was new and and epoch creating?
Well, there was, and this was particularly the importance of humanist boosters of print, and there was much of the same sort of rhetoric that it greets the Renaissance, that the darkness is being turned into light and all this sort of thing. But there was also frustration that people wouldn't behave as they'd intended them to. You know, it's one thing if you're a humanist to want more text for yourselves, but you don't have much good advice for the printers how they can dispose of the other 499 copies. Mm-hmm. And I think what thwarts technology is that a lot of the boosterism come from people who've invested on the production side, the printers or the people who've invested in these new technologies. Whereas we as consumers are actually more canny. We take what we like of the new without abandoning the old. I use the internet every day, but I still have a massive collection of books, and I still buy books. I mean, when I graduated from university all too long ago and did a PhD, my college tutor cheered himself up by saying to me, "You'll never write a book." Now, what I think he meant was not, "You are too stupid to write a book," but that technology is changing so fast that books will become redundant. In fact, 90% of the copies bought of my books are still hard copy print books. Various forms of digital production make up less than 10% of the sales. In the same way, in the 15th and 16th century, people took print when they liked, but they still bought manuscripts. They still copied printed books into manuscripts. They bound them up together in impromptu miscellanies, which were part print, part manuscript. In the 17th century, by far the most valued source of news were confidential newsletters issued every week, which were handwritten. The idea that one technology supersedes another in this way is very simple. I remember a meeting we were summoned to by publishers about, do you remember something called the CD-ROM? Well, we were summoned by the publishers to be enthralled by this. And they would say we should get rid of our books and just use the CD-ROM. And one of the people in the audience said, "Well, you think about books, you know, I can come to the library, I can gather 7 books around me on a table and move them. How's the CD-ROM going to do this?" Now, by this point, the publishers were very, very cross with us for not seeing the future. And the lady from OUP just looked at him and said, "Well, perhaps you'll just have to work that little bit harder." And I thought that exactly epitomized the investor side of this. You know, you're not playing ball. Well, you know, the CD-ROM is gone. The lady from OUP is very gone. And, you know, we still have our books.
Nick, forgive me, I got in your way. Here.
Hello, it's Nick Hotham. You talk very eloquently about France and the Netherlands and Germany. What echoes and parallels in Scotland existed in the 16th and 17th centuries to these changes?
Well, Scotland is very late to the feast. They have, like Wittenberg, there's no part in the incunabular age. The first books published in Scotland are, I think, in 1508 or 1509. Our Vice-Chancellor actually has written an edition of these first books. And printing, it remains a very subsidiary market, a subsidiary essentially of England, with Edinburgh a satellite market of the wider English market. I think there's about 300 books known for the entire 16th century printed locally. It gradually begins to develop its own relationship with the continental centres like the Dutch Republic, being supplied directly from the Netherlands rather than via England. So it grows in that way. And that, of course, gives us a fascinating question of how a Reformation can be established in a place with so few books. It's a very good controlled experiment. And the fact that Scotland becomes very successfully a Calvinist country from mid-century is interesting because print plays very little part in that.
Yes, front here.
Thank you. John McPaker. 2 comments, if I may. Just in terms, referring back to language and to the German language, perhaps it may be easy to assume that Luther utilizes a shared and common German language. Perhaps it might be better to say that he develops a Saxon variant of Germanic language, and that in time becomes, especially through the German New Testament and Luther's publication of it, German language as such. And I wonder if you might have made a comment on that process. And then just picking up on that most recent point, in 1525 that the Scottish Parliament prohibited the reading and distribution of Lutheran tracts. Do we know at all what it was they were prohibiting as early as 1525?
Yeah, they would have been prohibiting imported Lutheran works, not works published in Scotland. You're quite right to say that Luther is credited with a very substantial part in the fixing of a German language. But on the other hand, Luther's books were also translated into Low German. So there was still a very clear distinction made in his own period between Low German for the Hamburg, Emden, Rostock area, and High German for the south. Interestingly, the historical record of those books suffered a shattering blow in the turmoil of the middle of the 20th century, when many of those libraries were bombed to smithereens. And we rely very heavily on a catalogue of Low German 16th century books compiled before the war, which often offers the only record of many of these texts which have now been completely lost.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your talk. I'm Peter Ismail, chairman of a research charity called Bach Network UK. So I'll slightly track forward in Lutheranism. We all associate Luther with the printing of the Bible, but I think one of the other reasons that must have made the print trade very pleased with him was the invention of the chorale. It's perhaps worth noting that the only surviving hymn book from J.S. Bach's library, the hymn book of the Bohemian Brethren, which is, I think, from 1547, sits in Glasgow University Library Special Collections. We're very lucky it has survived. We also had the Wittenberg translations into Scots of German chorales. And so by the time of Bach, there are about 6,000 chorales. These all need to be printed and disseminated as Protestant propaganda. They were completely loathed by the Jesuits. They considered the chorale was the work of the devil.
Well, thank you for those remarks. Obviously, I mean, you're quite right. Luther's contribution to the development of a musical tradition is extremely important. He was a man of great musical sensibility. He wrote hymns, but he also embedded singing in the worship service. Now, that's extremely important because we move from a position where many members of the laity will have been largely observers of the worship service to one in which they were actively participating and lustily singing. Of course, this was not without difficulties for the print world, because the printing of musical type is a whole new problem. In the first instance, this involves double impression printing, where you print the staff line first and then take the paper off and then try and exactly fix the paper in the right place. So when the notes go on, now you only have to make a marginal mistake there, and the results are catastrophic. So what they do eventually is they print a new alphabet of notes with a tiny portion of staff line behind them. So you then put them together in the same way as movable type. That's extremely expensive, and it means that music publishing becomes a much more specialist activity than publishing in general. And so that has a slightly separate development in the history of print.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes, back.
Thank you. Graham Cruikshank. It is remarkable how the advent of printing sped up the distribution of the written word. You mentioned that Luther's pamphlets took only 2 days, set up, print, distribute. And perhaps that was very wise to limit it to 8 pages or less, so you get out his thoughts so quickly. And then you said the survival rate of these pamphlets is quite often due to them being bound. You said that sometimes it was miscellanies, but I'm wondering if in your researches you detected any conscious sequencing of these pamphlets which enabled you to follow a religious debate through, or was it too random for that?
Well, do you know, that's an extremely interesting question, and the truth is that our access to this has been often damaged by the well-intentioned vandalism of libraries who've taken these works out of their collections and rebound them separately. This was very common in the 19th century. It was particularly damaging when they disbound these collections, which are part print and part manuscript, and sent the manuscripts to the manuscript reading room and the print to the print reading room. And that completely destroyed this sense of unity. So you've set there a research question which is very difficult to make much progress with in the current state of the historical record. What you do find is, where they survive, is some attempt at thematic collections, some collections which gather together all the pamphlets of a particular year, and so on and so forth. But this is more evident, in fact, in the 17th century, particularly for the Dutch Republic, where there has been so much less interest in the pamphlets that they, librarians didn't give them the treatment, if you see what I mean.
Well, Andrew, thank you. Before I ask the President to give a formal vote of thanks, let's make one concluding remark. I was particularly struck by the efforts that are being made to track down missing books. Now, the notion of tracking down missing books, I think we must applaud. The notion of tracking down missing CD-ROMs or missing floppy disks is actually pointless because they cannot, in any case, be accessed. Can we therefore bear in mind that good quality paper, if it's kept in good quality circumstances, will last just about forever? I was frequently asked when I ran the British Library why we didn't just digitize the lot and throw the originals away. I wasn't going to throw away Magna Carta. Dame Jocelyn.
So I want first to thank the Albertus Institute for having the courage and the magnanimity to mark Luther's 500th anniversary. I think that's very splendid and very, very commendable. And I'm neither Protestant nor Catholic. You may notice the accent, I'm Northern Irish. And it's particularly important to say in that context, I'm Quaker, which is neither Protestant nor Catholic. Northern Ireland is a whole other story, but thank you very much, Professor Pettegree, for a wonderful lecture, clear, informative, fascinatingly illustrated, and going well beyond Luther in a way that I hadn't expected. We've learnt what sells or what sold. At one point I worked at the University of Bath, and there was a story there which may be apocryphal, that one day a gentleman called Alan Lane was on Bath railway station trying to find a small book to read on the train, and there wasn't. So he invented penguins, from which several other things spun out. Your story has reminded me a bit of the invention of penguins and the corresponding change in the reading habits of a lot of people. And I too particularly appreciated your description of the detective work to identify lost books. Absolutely wonderful, lovely piece of lateral thinking, or turning the book the other way over, or whatever analogy you want to use. Will you join me, please, in thanking this evening's speaker for a magnificent lecture?
Jocelyn, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, just before you go, can I remind you that there are details of other Royal Society of Edinburgh events available outside. This being 2017, you will each receive an email asking you to give your view on this evening. It's called Online Evaluation. There is a drinks reception next door, very generously donated by Lyon and Turnbull, who are established heavily in the second-hand book trade. Bless them. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming. Thank you in particular to those who responded actively to the lecture. But most of all, of course, thank you, Andrew Pettegree. He was a wonderful colleague. Andrew, thank you.